Welcome back to the Virtual Classroom, AP Euro Edition. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. Today's topic, economic recovery and unity in Europe post-World War II. Now, as always, take a moment, hit pause on your screen, take a minute, jot down the lecture outline, and pay particular attention to those key terms. Make sure you can identify the who, what, where, when, and why, as well as be able to tie the key terms one to another into their greater significance. Now, with that, let's get started. Now, this is going to be a very unique lecture for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, this is, as you will notice, lecture 39. This is the last lecture of the year for AP European History. I know you're all weeping, drying a tear of sorrow right now. This is the last lecture. Of course, it will be broken into two parts. And just a heads up, we will be covering points 1, 2, and 3 during this half of the lecture, and then we'll come back for point number 4, culture after World War II, in part 2 of the lecture. Now, the second thing that makes this lecture unique, as you all know me, I teach very chronologically. I like to teach this happens, and that's how I like to teach these eras. And for the most part, I do. Now, I might take 2 lectures to cover one time period, or have one lecture on political, next lecture on, say, social and cultural issues within the same time frame. But generally speaking, I do not teach thematically. This lecture, however, is unique in that this will be more thematic. Because the 2 previous lectures have covered this post-World War II period and discussed the origins and foundations of the Cold War, basically from 1945 through 1979. And then the last lecture covered the collapse and the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union from the period 1979 through, well, the present. But now we're going to back up again, and we're going to retread over some of the same ground. And we're going to cover the same time period, 1945, end of World War II, through the present to discuss what else is going on. Because the reality is, when talking about the post-World War II period, the entire global history is consumed and subsumed by the Cold War itself. Now, we can't forget the Cold War, because that is an important backdrop. And again, if you ever have an essay prompt or just when thinking about this lecture, realize the context for it, the backdrop for it, is the Cold War still. So that will still be playing a very large, looming role in this lecture. But there is other things going on in Europe and in the world besides just the battle between communism and democracy. And so we're going to talk about that. And remember, so we're covering the same time frame. We're going to start right back again in 1945. Specifically 1944, because even before the war ends, before World War II ends, the European leaders are already talking about how do we recreate our world? What comes next? What comes after the world is done with a global war? And it starts in 1944 with the Bretton Woods Conference. And you see the picture of it there. Now, the Bretton Woods Conference lays the foundations for the modern international monetary system. And this is very important not only to European but to global history. As after the Second World War, and we're going to discuss 3 main areas of this, but there were a good number of important developments in a global sense. Realizing that yes, nationalism existed. Yes, self-determination was important and existed. Creating greater harmony among nations and maybe decolonizing a bit, that was important. But to help do that, the United States helped, but mostly in this case, the European side of things, they wanted to create a financial backbone to try to help this process. And of course, part of it was to stabilize their own economy and to recover after World War II. And so at the Bretton Woods Conference, the international monetary system was developed. And one of the things that was passed was known as GATT. That's G-A-T-T. And that stands for the General Agreements of Tariff and Trade. And it sought to stimulate international trade by lowering tariffs and other trade restrictions. Now, if you think about it from a modern US context, think about like NAFTA, the idea of free trade between member nations. And so this was the idea. Now, this isn't free trade per se, but this was the stepping stone to get to that point. And of course, the ultimate, what we're going to get to by the end of this lecture today, of course, is the European Union. And kind of that first big step right before World War II ends was this idea of this general agreement of tariff and trade to reduce the tariffs and restrictions in order to stimulate international trade between these nations. Now, between 1958 and 1971, the value of national currencies was based on gold and based off the US dollar. Now, that's starting to change in the more modern day, but for much of this period, it was heavily reliant on the US dollars being the standard bearer. And under that, they created what was called the International Monetary Fund. Now, I mentioned that in the last lecture briefly. But what the IMF is, the International Monetary Fund, this was a national banking system that was designed to provide short-term loans to struggling countries to prevent economic crisis and anarchy. Of course, you can see how well that fits in with the Cold War aspect to prevent nations from falling to communism. So if a government is struggling financially, the IMF can step in and help them to prevent a government overthrow, provide stability. Now, there are some downsides to this, and I'll get to those in a second, but the benefit was the IMF is instrumental to the post-war economic boom in both the world and specifically in Europe. Now, in order to facilitate longer-term loans, part of the Bretton Woods Conference created what's called the World Bank, still in existence today. And the World Bank provided long-term loans for economic growth. So the IMF was designed for short-term loans, basically to bail out struggling governments, to prop them up. And the World Bank is designed for long-term loans, for long-term substantial economic growth. Now, both of these, on the one hand, provide economic boom to post-war Europe. Fantastic. They will also help provide for these struggling, newly decolonized nations post-World War II. Nice. The downside to them comes, however, in places like Central America and even Mexico. Because what happens is when these struggling nations go to the World Bank or the IMF for help, the IMF and the World Bank, which again, remember, one of the key nations here is Great Britain, one is France, one is the United States. And they will put some heavy stipulations and restrictions on the money that is given. Now, on the one hand, it's understandable because they want to protect their investment. On the other standpoint, though, they often do so with a very Eurocentric, egotistical mindset. Now, they're doing it to protect their money. Again, I get that. But for instance, in places, say, like Mexico or Central America, they will often tell countries, no, stop growing corn, which is what your people want, but corn is not what the world wants. The world wants wheat. So why don't you grow wheat, which only the elites in your society eat? Because, well, that's what we want as an international community. So they actually can dictate what crops are being developed by these nations that accept funds from them. In addition, they also will tell them what seeds to use. So if the world communities develop some kind of new genetic seed that supposedly will grow better in their region, they are now being forced to use that even if there's not substantial testing that could have long-term impacts on the health of the population. So on the one hand, there's some great benefits to this. On the other hand, there's a dirty underside that actually causes nations who accept help from the IMF or the World Bank to lose some of their autonomy, which can cause great animosity and great hardship in the long run. Now, of course, the other big outcome in this period, besides the Bretton Woods Conference, was, of course, the United Nations. We talked about that a little briefly before as it was set up. So I'm not going to go into it in great detail again right here, but no, this was created in 1945. Again, it helped to establish a new world order to preserve peace and prosperity in the world. And of course, part of this was the Security Council that consisted of 12 nations, including 5 permanent members. And of course, these permanent members were the victors of World War II: the US, China, France, Great Britain, and of course the Soviet Union. Now, Outside the Security Council, the General Assembly of the United Nations would include virtually every country in the world. And of course, if you're say a new nation or who's seeking independence, you know you've been accepted and have quote unquote arrived when you've been accepted to sit in the General Council. Unfortunately, the General Assembly, the General Council, the General Assembly. And the General Assembly has the power to advise, but they can't really enforce any recommendations. That's the job of the Security Council, which again, you're putting the fate of the world in the hands of 5 nations, and 2 of which are bitterly opposed between communism and democracy, the Cold War. But this provides the political and economic framework for the future unified Europe. Now, we talked a lot about Eastern Europe in the last couple of lectures as part of the Cold War. But Western Europe had extreme problems as well, both politically and economically post-World War II. Remember, their nations were in shambles. The war had taken place in their countries. They were war-torn, their economies were ravaged, and not to mention the deaths of millions upon millions of people. And so there was significant economic hardship in the direct post-World War II period. There was runaway inflation, scarcity of food, and black markets plagued the economy, charging exorbitant prices. A number of the major European cities are in shambles, destroyed, and damaged. Many people believe that Europe was finished. Recovery from such a cataclysmic event seemed almost unthinkable. Of course, the worst place, of course, was West Germany and ultimately East Germany. But Germany was one of the hardest hits thanks to the heavy bombing of both the Soviets and the rest of the Allied powers. And so what we see in the immediate wake of World War II is how do you save Europe? Now, politically, it eventually became a little more liberal. And again, this is where you finally get the triumph of liberalism that began in the 1800s. And it starts with the Christian Democrats. They became a dominant force in political movements in several European nations. And what they see in this is a common European heritage, yes, but also a common Christian heritage. And they rejected the authoritarianism. They rejected the narrow nationalism. Now, it's not that they're not proud to be part of their countries. It's that they reject that narrow ultra-nationalism that could lead to fascism. And they had faith in democracy. They had faith in cooperation. They had faith in unifying with other nations as a means to propel themselves to greater heights. And so these Christian Democrats, along with Catholic parties, they were also very progressive, i.e. liberal. And you're going to see a number of them begin to grow throughout Europe. Now, in other areas, in places like France and Italy, we will see the emergence of both socialist and communist parties, which again, also seeking to promote some parts of liberalism. Again, racial equality, greater equality for economics because your state is taking over more industries to facilitate better for the workers. And so the result of this is social reform and political transformation that will create the foundation for a great European Renaissance. Let me say that again. The growth of the Christian Democratic Party, the growth of Catholic parties, the growth of both communist and socialist parties in places like France and Italy. These groups who, while in some ways are antithetical to one another, they don't agree on everything, but they do agree as a greater liberalist tradition. They believe in the idea of liberalism that had already been cemented in the United States for this period. But in Europe, it had largely been still conservative, which is what helped lead to the rise of fascism. But this new birth of liberalism, the Christian Democrats, the Catholic Working Party, the socialist and communist parties that were willing to work across party lines, helped create the foundation for a great European Renaissance and recovery. And of course, in France, General Charles de Gaulle, he had been an inspiring wartime leader, helped reestablish the free and democratic Fourth Republic of France. I know you're all getting tired of hearing about the different republics of France, but between 1946 and 1958, France will reestablish a free and democratic government known as the Fourth Republic, led by Charles de Gaulle. And the presidency was largely ceremonial, but the real power lay with the legislature. And the Catholic Party will provide some of the best post-war leaders. Now, socialist influence is also important, as some major industries were nationalized by the government. In other words, even though they did not want to turn to communism, this growth of liberalism and the idea of protecting worker rights and bettering working conditions led to a growth of socialism and the nationalism of some key industries. Now, in France, in 1958 to the present, would give birth to the Fifth Republic. Yes, there's a Fifth Republic in France. I said that right. So 1958, the return of President Charles de Gaulle, who returns to power in 1958, they will grant the president more power. And that's why we separate the Fourth and Fifth Republic in France. Because under the Fourth Republic, most of the power lay in the legislature. In the Fifth Republic, a greater amount of the power lies in the president. In this case, Charles de Gaulle starts it. And so we see the growth of liberalism and power in France, and even some socialism in there. In Britain, they follow a very similar path to France. The leading party leader there of the Socialist Labour Party was Clement Attlee. And he will defeat Winston Churchill and the Conservatives in 1945 and assume power. Attlee will move toward the establishment of the quote-unquote welfare state. Many industries are nationalized. Government provided each citizen with free medical service and medical care. They tax the middle and upper classes more heavily to pay for this. So you talk about the idea with modern day United States, socialized medicine. Many people look at what Britain did in 1945, 1946, as they nationalized many industries. And again, the idea was these became rights of the people needed for the stability of a greater Great Britain versus private industry. And of course, there's still debates in the United States about the role of socialism now. And it's going to be debated upon again thanks to the coronavirus. So Great Britain follows a very similar trajectory. They do a little bit quicker, but they will socialize in many ways. Again, this is not a socialist takeover. It's not communism, but it is trying to promote more equality between people and the government protecting them through the welfare state, a social safety net. In Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany, i.e. West Germany, they had begun a long, highly successful democratic rule. And the Christian Democrats will also become West Germany's majority party for more than a generation. The result of all of this, again, this is not the only reason, but the result of all this was a quote-unquote economic miracle. It was unprecedented economic growth, some of the largest economic growth in European history post-World War II. Europe entered a period of rapid economic progress that lasted into the late 1960s. And again, you see the comparison to the United States. Post-World War II United States had unprecedented economic growth from 1940s all the way through the late 60s, almost 1970. In the same time frame in Europe as well. Why? Well, by 1963, Western Europe produced more than 2.5 times more than they did prior to the war. So industry was booming. Consumerism was booming. We'll talk about consumerism later in this lecture. Now, what helps this? Well, the stability and changeover of these governments into a more liberalist tradition helped solidify and sustain this growth. Now, stimulating this growth, of course, was the Marshall Plan given by the United States in George Marshall, Secretary of State. His plan, 1947, the $13 billion, will greatly stimulate the growth of Western Europe. In addition to that, while it's not often talked about, the Korean War will be a tremendous impetus of growth. War is what got many nations out of the Great Depression. Well, if you want to stimulate the economy, by the mid-1950s, we are now involved, the world is, in the Korean War / Korean conflict. Well, this produces the need for war goods, which means factories are booming, people are working, and people are making money. And this economic growth is the basic objective of all these Western European nations, and all of them accept a certain brand of economics. Yes, Keynesianism. Keynesianism is the economic model embraced by all Western nations, Western European and the United States, post World War II. Governments were willing to use deficit spending to make more resources available for the people. So Keynesian economics originally was designed how do you get out of a depression or recession? You spend your way out of it. Well, in this case, to help create sustained economic growth, Keynesianism, under Keynesianism, the governments were willing to use deficit spending to make more resources available for the people, thus stimulating consumerism and somewhat materialism, which has its benefits and negatives we'll talk about later. Germany and France were especially successful in this model. And in most countries, the workers were willing to work hard for low wages, which benefited the expanding industries. The increased demand in consumer goods resulted, and this became a cyclical process. As workers who were working for less money made more goods, people began to use their excess money after the war to buy these goods, which in turn helped wages increase, which turned out more goods, which facilitated more buying, which facilitated the making of more goods. And many economic barriers have been eliminated, resulting in a large unified market emerging known as the quote-unquote common market. And again, this was largely facilitated by the GATT, the GATT, we talked about a few minutes ago. So how did some of these nations employ this? Well, in France, they used the Marshall Plan and they nationalized the banking system to funnel money directly into key industries, many of which were state-owned. This gave them full control over the economy. So examples of this, of nationalized industries, included large banks, insurance companies, public utilities, coal mines, and the Renault Auto Company. Again, these were all things like, say, like public utilities and insurance. These were now seen as rights that every citizen should enjoy, not the privilege of a select few. Now, there are many arguments to be made back and forth, but the general consensus was here that things like public utilities and coal mines needed to heat homes and power factories. These things are rights of people to have that need to be run by the government and not given to the whimsy of private individuals or to the whimsy of the market, the free market system. Instead, the government needs to control these to ensure that there is stability and to provide that all citizens have equal access to things like healthcare, things like banks, things like insurance companies. Remember, Great Depression, a lot of these things had failed miserably. So this was Europe's response compared to, say, how FDR and the New Deal ran. Now, of course, what this led to, of course, was the creation of the welfare state, which I know gets some very bad ideas and bad definitions in the modern context, but the reality is this was a social safety net for people to provide equal rights to all. And so Western European nations sought to provide universal services to all their people. That's what the welfare state really is. It's not a dirty word. Now, I know it is in modern US politics, but the welfare state defined is that these nations seek to provide universal services to all people. So employment, unemployment and disability insurance, social security for the elderly, free or at least heavily subsidized healthcare, and the redistribution of wealth and income by placing higher taxes on wealthier citizens. Not that they're trying to take away all the money from millionaires and billionaires, but trying to make it a little more equal, not quite so spread out as you see in places like the United States or in the Soviet Union. And the idea of this was not just, the welfare state was universal. It was not just being given to just the poor and the unemployed, which had largely been the case up to World War I. You see, before World War I, liberals believed that you should only focus these liberal ideals upon the poor and unemployed, the ones who needed it most. But under the welfare state after World War II, it was not designed to punish the wealthy at the at their expense to help the poor. It was meant to benefit all people equally. These were rights that all citizens should be allowed to have. And of course, this has evolved over time. Yes, it was healthcare back in post 45. In modern day, the question is, well, is internet now a right or a privilege? Well, as this video is in large part being made because of the coronavirus quarantine, can we have a new discussion now on whether or not internet and Wi-Fi is a right of all people, especially all students, to have equal access should a quarantine ever become necessary ever again? It's a worthy discussion to have. So in France, they created the welfare system under Charles de Gaulle. In West Germany, it was the Christian Democrats who employed the welfare state. In Italy, socialism helped Italy form the welfare state. And of course, Britain became the model for the welfare state and a quote-unquote mixed economy, because they employed both the Socialist Labour Party and their Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, you see pictured there. And as a Socialist Labour Party member, he tried to find a mixed economy. And the idea of it was to find a middle ground that would help sustain economic growth despite economic downturns. And this challenge came in the 1970s. Let's go forward a minute here to 1970s. Because in the 1970s, we find that many conservatives blamed liberalism for the huge economic downturn of the 1970s, which was largely caused, of course, by the energy crisis and oil crisis. And what we see is conservatives argued the welfare state was the cause through excessive growth and high taxation. And the reality was by the 1970s, throughout Europe, the welfare state began to be trimmed, especially in places like Great Britain, led by a very conservative Margaret Thatcher. We talked about her last time. She begins to privatize some industries that had been state-owned and restricting labor strikes. In other words, roll back some of those more liberal tendencies. And this created a more mixed economy by the 1970s, which is in some places where they still have to the present day. So remember, the high point of liberalism was that 1945 to 1968, 1970 period. There was a good 25 years where liberalism reigned throughout much of the Western world, Western Europe and the United States. By the 1970s, though, conservatism began to take hold. And by the 1980s, it was firmly entrenched, leading to a rollback of many of those more liberal ideas. But many of those things still remain, like universal health care, like having privatized banks in order to prevent, again, rolling back things too far, create this mixed economy. And all this will lay the foundation for a unified Europe. So how does Europe finally unify politically, economically, socially? Well, three major streams for European unity developed. The first was political. They created what was called the Council of Europe. And it contained nearly every European nation, but each had very little influence. So in some respects, this kind of mirrored the General Assembly in the United Nations. Every European nation was a part of it, but they had very little say overall and very little clout to actually push their weight around. The second stream of it was military. And quite honestly, this never fully materializes. It never actually takes off the ground. We don't get a unified European military. The third was economic, which is by far the most successful of the groups. And with the development ultimately of the European Union through various stages throughout history that will culminate in the European Union we have today. So let's go back and talk about the Council of Europe for a minute, that first stream. You see, the Council of Europe was created in 1948, again, right after the Second World War. And in the Council of Europe, European federalists hoped the Council would quickly evolve into a true European Parliament system that had its own sovereign rights, but yet still respect the sovereign rights of individual nations. Now, this did not happen. In large part because no one could ever really give up their individual sovereignty to this greater idea. versus Britain with its vast empire and its quote-unquote special relationship with the United States, was opposed to giving up any of their sovereignty and power to the Council. I mean, if Britain doesn't join, quite honestly, it'd be doomed to fail from the beginning. Brexit. Now, there would be a second when it came to the economic model. So politically, it never really develops for the longest time until 1992. But economically, things did work. And it starts with the EEC, the European Economic Community. The EEC, once again, the European Economic Community. And it starts with the Treaty of Rome in 1957. And in the Treaty of Rome 1957, they will create the European Economic Community, the EEC, i.e., aka, quote unquote, the common market. It was signed by 6 nations in the European coal and steel community. This was the first goal of the treaty was a gradual reduction of tariffs among the 6 to create a single market almost as large as the United States. Now, see this for a minute here. The European coal and steel, these 6 nations that produce some of the most coal and steel in Europe, joined together to reduce tariffs to create a single unified marketplace that would rival almost the size of the United States, the largest exporter of coal and steel. And they're able to do so. Other goals were to create the free movement of capital and labor across borders. Again, you need cheap labor sources, and allowing laborers to move from poorer European nations to richer nations facilitates the growth of certain industries. Third major goal. First major goal was coal and steel. Second major goal was free movement of capital and labor. Third major goal, common economic policies and institutions. In other words, you don't want to have drastic differences in the types of institution and policies or laws in, say, Germany versus Italy. Because if workers move between the two of them, how can you have a common economic pricing system if these laws and policies are facilitating demanding differences in pricing? So a common economic policy and institution. And the fourth one is reduced tariffs on regional specialization. In other words, some regions specialize and have a comparative advantage of producing some goods based on geography, based on natural resources. Well, reduce those tariffs to help stimulate, so don't give one nation a monopoly on certain goods. This facilitates, well, higher priced goods and creates inequity. So by helping to level the playing field, this will help create a situation where all members can benefit. But the strategy was under fire initially from the very beginning. Britain was hesitant to give up their sovereignty. France would take a step back almost immediately. A bitter colonial war with Algeria is ultimately going to lead to the election of 1958, the reinstallation of Charles de Gaulle, and of course, we said earlier, the Fifth Republic of France. But also causes France to step back from European unity and for France to withdraw from what they consider the quote-unquote US-controlled NATO, because France wanted to develop their own nuclear program, and they felt they were being stymied by all these new ideas of global unity. They were being stymied by the United States and NATO from nuclear supremacy. They're being stymied for economic growth by the European unity that was starting to develop in the 50s. And of course, as I said, Britain, they won't even enter this idea until 1973. And so for a long period of time, this is very slow among the quote-unquote weaker European nations, as France and Great Britain take a long time to actually join and withdraw for France. It won't be until 1992 when the European Union is finally forged. Now, it was started a long time prior, it had been a long time coming. It's officially created, though, in 1992. And the idea was that with the European Union, they would create a single European currency, the euro, have a common defense and foreign policy initiatives. Now, of course, big surprise, in Great Britain, the very conservative Margaret Thatcher led Britain's opposition to the EU until she resigned in November of 1990. She was replaced by a conservative successor, John Major, who urged limited federalism. But finally, in 1991, you see on the screen the Maastricht Treaty, 1991, promised the most radical revision of the European community since its beginning. And under the Maastricht Treaty in 1991, they will finally create the Eurodollar, or the euro. They became the single currency of the EU. Again, it didn't develop fully until 2002. So it took 11 years to actually fully be implemented. But the idea of the euro was a integrated currency among the 12 Western and Central European nations that belonged to it. Now, all the original member nations agreed to the idea of the euro, this European monetary union, except, of course, for Great Britain, which refused to join the European monetary union of the Eurodollar and instead preferred to maintain the sovereignty of their own currency, the pound. Again, this fits with the conservative regime that had been in power for much of the 80s and 90s in Great Britain. But nevertheless, the European Community, EC, began to grow. By 1925, there were 15 members, including Germany, France, Italy, Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, United Kingdom, Ireland, Spain, Portugal, Slovakia, and Slovenia. I'm sorry, scratch off Slovakia and Slovenia. Instead, Greece, Austria, and Finland. So let me repeat those real quick. 1995, there's Germany, France, Italy, Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, United Kingdom, Ireland, Spain, Portugal, Greece, Austria, and Finland. And then by 2005, they will add 10 new nations, including Cyprus, the Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Malta, Poland, and now Slovakia and Slovenia. And in 1996, they would rename the European Community to its new name, which still is known today, the European Union, which of course is losing one of its members currently, as Great Britain has elected to leave the European Union, and only the future will tell us whether this is a good or bad move. But it is the result, of course, of a very conservative government that took over about 5 years ago in Great Britain, as they began to push for more conservative autonomy, and of course greater diplomatic autonomy. Now we're going to take a break right here and come back and then go back again to 1945 and talk about not the political and economic side of things, but instead about social and cultural issues. So until next time, bye-bye.